In the book of Luke, chapter 23, verse 44, it says, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." It had been a long day, a long, painful day. No, really, it had been a long, painful journey, which had culminated in this long, painful day. Jesus had been hanging on the cross, lynched by a collaboration between temple and empire, church and state, because they didn't like him. They didn't like it that he reached the people, that the people followed him and loved him. They didn't like it that he cared about people, no matter how vigorously the church and the state rejected them. He touched them and healed them and spoke to the untouchables, including a woman with an issue of blood and a man who had demons within him. He visited the sick and he raised the dead. He cared about the Jews, of course, but he also cared about the Gentiles and those who may have stopped going to the synagogue or to the temple because the rules were so stringent and the church leaders had been so judgmental. The bosses of the church and the state felt threatened by him. And so they collaborated. They schemed, bringing him up on trumped up charges, riling up their base, throwing their base red meat, so that when they were able to take him down, they would have the support of the masses that they needed. They had spewed fake news and circulated a big lie, and it had ended in this very painful day, this very painful moment. It had been hot during the day. Jesus had been unable to wave away the vultures that flew near his battered and hanging body, smelling imminent death, which would provide them with their evening meal. He had been unable to wipe the sweat off his brow, which burned as it got into his eyes and stung as it seeped into the wounds of his ravaged body. He had been unable to lift his feet. The cross was probably only about 7 feet high, which made it easy for hungry animals to nip at his feet. The women who sat at the foot of the cross would have been shooing those animals away all day long. He was miserable. He was suffering. He was suffocating, the weight of his body making it impossible for his lungs to function. And he had been unable to shift on the cross to make his breathing easier. It had been a long, painful day. And while he was on that cross and suffering, I wonder if he thought back over his ministry, if he had done enough, if he had pleased God, if he had reached enough people. He thought about it, even as he struggled not to hurt so much. It had been a long day. But then in the afternoon, something happened. After hanging on that cross, all those hours during which he was able to feel his wounds and had to struggle to breathe, something happened. He stopped thinking back. He began to think forward, and he began to understand that his life would now be the standard by which all who loved God and him, God's Son, would have to live. He didn't know their names, but he knew that more were going to come. People like Fannie Lou Hamer and Medgar Evers and Cesar Chavez, people like Mary McLeod Bethune and Thurgood Marshall and Reverend C.T. Vivian and Representative John Lewis. He didn't know their names, but he knew they would come. People like Vernon Damer and Reverend Jim Lawson and the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. He didn't know their names, but he knew that there would be people who would come and fight for justice, for people like Emmett Till and George Floyd and Elijah McClain and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland. He began to think, and he began to understand that his life was really beginning in a new way. He began to accept that others would come and that his time on earth that was nearly up was really just beginning. He began to see people who would fight presidents who lied and spread fake news, even as he blamed everything on everybody else. He saw people like Ida B. Wells Barnett and Frederick Douglass and Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who would go toe-to-toe with the church and the state. He saw people who would commend their spirits to God as they did the work, as they fought against the injustice that they faced. He knew that these people would commend their spirits to God as they fought for their loved ones who were hunted down by a group of people, including law enforcement, enforcement officers, judges, attorneys, doctors, members of the elite who thought it no big thing to not only hunt them down, but to kill them. He saw people who would commend their spirits so that they would be able to stand, even as there was seldom justice rendered for their slain loved ones. He would see them in his mind's eye as they commended their spirits, even as qualified immunity allowed police officers to merely say, only had to say that they believed that their lives were in danger in order to be allowed to kill their loved ones with impunity. Jesus knew that there would have to be those who would commend their lives into the hands of God as they continued to swallow the pain of death of their loved ones and the invisibility of justice based primarily on race. And because of their commending their spirits to God, Jesus knew that they would be all right. Because in the act of commending their spirits to God, God would fill them with a strength that the world did not give and which the world would not be able to take away. There would be mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and husbands and wives. There would be those who would be wounded but determined to keep the fight for justice alive. People like Adrian Hood and Lucy Macbeth and Sabrina Fulton and the families of George Floyd and Philando Castile and Henry Green and Andre Hill and Casey Goodson. He would know, Jesus knew that they would be able to stand up and hold on because Jesus the Christ had given them example. He had knew what was going on. And so he commended his spirit to God. He saw these people and he understood that now he could rest. His work would go on. In effect, in his spirit, he said, I am done. Done like you are when you finally let go of a relationship that is not good to you or for you. Done like you are when you refuse to let your past determine your future and dominate your present. Done like you decide that the enemies behind you are not as powerful as the God who is above you. Done like you are when you refuse to cry over someone you love but who has not loved you back. Done like you are when you determine that you are not going to let church or the state steal your joy or your rights. Done like you are when you determine that if the state wants to jail you for fighting for injustice, it can just go on ahead. Jesus was done. And with the last bit of strength, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And just maybe before he breathed his last breath, he started to sing in his spirit, Lord, I done. Lord, I done. Lord, I done what you told me to do. He commended to God his spirit and breathed his last breath. But the breath didn't stay on that cross. That breath began to move out over the presence of the earth. It was a breath like the blood that will never lose its power. It was a breath that would fuel the work of all those who were yet to come, who would remember what Jesus had done and why. Jesus' spirit, his last breath, is still with us, reminding us to work while it is yet day and be fueled by that breath, his breath, which the world could not take away. That breath reminds us to commend our spirits to God as we do the work so that we too can sing, Lord, I done. Amen.